Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Karen Wilson. I am a pediatric neuropsychologist and the founder of Child Nexus. You're joining us for one of our Child Nexus live events. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our guest speaker today, but I want to make sure that she has time to share her presentation. So we are going to be talking today about when struggles overlap, understanding the link between mental health and learning challenges, which is a topic that I feel very passionate about. I've spent the last 20 years supporting students who think and learn differently or have mental health challenges. And this is such an important topic and it's often overlooked. And I'm thrilled to have with us today Barbara Aerosmith Young. Barbara is, for those of you who don't know Barbara, she is an innovator and an author in the field of neuroeducation. And her work utilizes principles of neuroplasticity, and they're used worldwide to engage cognitive functioning and enhance cognitive functioning. Her vision is to put the brain into the education equation. Her work began in 1978 and is recognized as one of the first examples, one of the first practical applications of neuroplasticity to address learning difficulties. And its application has been expanded to address those dealing with traumatic brain injury, addiction, cognitive decline with aging, and those who want to enhance performance. Her journey and her work is documented in her best-selling book, The Woman Who Changed Her Brain, and in her TEDx talk. I'm going to put links to both of those in the show notes. Not the show notes, I'm thinking about podcasts. I'm going to drop them in the chat in a little while. And I also want you to know that through her work as director of the Aerosmith program, Barbara continues to engage in research to understand how we can drive neuroplasticity change in the brain to benefit learners of all ages. I am so thrilled to have Barbara here with us today, and I'm going to let her take it away.
Well, thank you, Karen. I really am excited to be here today, and thank everybody that is listening. I'm presenting on a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I'm very passionate about it. I lived the link between mental health and learning challenges with my own struggles with learning difficulties. And my life and my work has been an exploration of the territory of the human brain and how it makes us uniquely who we are. And I believe if we can understand this territory, we can have compassionate insight into our functioning and into the functioning of others. And I just want to note before I start the presentation that I'm going to be using the words learning difficulty, learning disability, learning problem, learning challenge interchangeably. I really have moved away from the term learning disability. I think it's quite a negative term. However, a lot of the research that I read over the last couple of weeks, just to update all the statistics on mental health issues and learning difficulties in North America, uses the term learning disability. So it may be interspersed in the presentation, but I think learning difficulty is an appropriate term because it is a difficulty. It's not just a difference, it's a difficulty. Having lived it, it presents its own challenges and difficulties. So just bear with me for a moment. I want to digress just to talk really briefly about the vision of the organization that I work for and with, is really to transform lives worldwide by improving cognitive capacities. And I'd like us all to think about how could we each help create a world where everybody has the ability to think flexibly, to reason causally, we can make better decisions, we're more compassionate, and learning as a process is accomplished with ease and joy. I firmly believe that our brain is our most valuable asset and that everyone should have the right to enhance and develop this asset. This is our rallying cry. And Norman Deutsch, who's the author of The Brain That Changes Itself, is very familiar with our work and talks about the fact that this work trains the brain processors that make reasoning and rationality possible, is a really important positive development for the world with its complex problems. So that's just sort of the framework within which I operate. So if we go back into mental health, I like to start with the World Health Organization's definition of mental health. I think it's a very comprehensive definition. So they have a series of components that they feel are critical, contributing to mental health, and it's to realize one's full potential, to be able to cope effectively with the normal stresses of life, to work productively and fruitfully, to make a contribution to one's community, to feel fulfilled and have a sense of well-being, and to be empathetic and compassionate. So I want us to kind of keep, if possible, this definition in mind as we go through what it's like to have a learning difficulty and how it impacts mental health. So this is some statistics coming out of Ontario, the Children's Mental Health Ontario, looking at children and teens who experience a mental health condition. And in the general population, it's 1 in 5, 20%. If we look at the population with identified learning difficulties, it's double that. It's 40%, 2 in 5. So certainly having a learning difficulty has a significant impact on mental health conditions. And mostly they were looking at things like depression, anxiety, low self-esteem. So obviously a learning difficulty is a major contributing factor. And I always like to look at like what underlies these stats. So we've got the statistics, and I want to break it out into kind of two components. So the first one that I want to talk about is our unique cognitive profile of cognitive strengths and weaknesses, and how this shapes our experience in the world, our experience of ourselves, of other people, of our functioning. And then the second one is general stressors related to the daily experience of living with a learning difficulty, irrespective of what cognitive functions are involved. So I want to start with the brain. And if we think about we can't really escape our brain. We carry it with us everywhere we go. And everything we do, underlying every single activity, every thought we have, is our brain. So whether we're talking, whether we're walking, whether we're scratching our nose, planning a budget, leading a project, our brain is engaged. And I just want to dispel that myth that we still sometimes hear that we only use 10% of our brain. It's actually not accurate. Over the course of the day, I guarantee you that every aspect of our brain is called upon to actively engage in whatever we're doing. And if there's an area that's underperforming or underfunctioning, it will have an impact. And the design of our brain, it's really a series of highways or stations. These are neural networks of brain regions that interconnect, and that they activate and collaborate, allowing us to function, to carry out different tasks. I'm going to talk a little bit about those cognitive functions. So one of the things I find fascinating is that each one of us has our own unique cognitive profile. And this cognitive profile is made up of, strengths and weaknesses of different cognitive functions. Our profile uniquely shapes who we are. Roger Sperry, who was a Nobel laureate many years ago in neuroscience, said no two brains are identical. They're as unique as our fingerprints. So our brains do really uniquely shape who we are. And if you think of someone you know, and you notice that there are physical differences between you and that person, like your hair color, your eye color, the shape of your nose, there are actually more differences between your two brains than all of the differences that you can see physically with your eyes. So pretty impressive. Our brain is very unique and very complex. So simply put, it does make us uniquely who we are. And a researcher at the University of Toronto a number of years ago looked at 1,452 students who'd completed the Arrowsmith assessment, looking at 19 different cognitive functions. And he found that 70% of those students had a unique profile shared with no other student, which to me, again, points to how unique and individual our cognitive profile is. So over my work, I came to understand that if we each think about our own learning process, we can identify areas that we excel at, that are really, really easy, and we can recognize areas that were not so good. I'm not really good driving slides. It's not an area that's a strength of mine. We might have a poor spatial sense and we get lost. We might not pick up languages. We might struggle with learning a foreign language. We might miss subtle social cues. And underpinning these abilities is our brain and our unique cognitive profile of strengths and weaknesses. And in most cases, we found ways to work around our difficulties because we might have one or two or three and not too sufficient or too extensive. However, a learning difficulty comes into play when there's what I call a cognitive load. And this is where there's a pileup of a number of critical cognitive functions that are underperforming, which makes it really, really difficult for the individual to compensate or work around. And so learning becomes a real challenge. And if people are curious, there's a questionnaire on our website. That's the URL there. You can just go into aerosmith.ca and find the questionnaire. It's totally confidential and it takes about 20 minutes to fill out. And you can either do it for yourself, you can do it for your spouse, you can do it for somebody you know. And based on your responses, it's going to give you your cognitive profile over 19 different cognitive functions. So I encourage people to check it out because to me, it gives insight into how we show up and how we operate in the world. So what are some of these cognitive functions? And what is a cognitive function? So I see a cognitive function as the job of a region of the brain or a network of regions that come together to operate, to carry out a specific activity or specific aspect of learning. So they operate on a continuum. So somebody could have very severe functioning in one of these cognitive functions, moderate, mild, average, or superior, above average functioning. And I've yet to meet any human being that has every cognitive function at the average or above average level. Everybody has something that causes some degree of challenge. And as I said, in most cases, we can work around or avoid them. So we think of some of these. One is the capacity to read nonverbal cues, and this is really critical for navigating the social world. We all know somebody that's socially awkward, who can't learn from feedback in social situations. That could potentially be because they have a difficulty in this cognitive function in the brain. Visual memory functions, these are really critical for learning how to read, learning how to spell. This is the person that might spell the word multiple different ways on the page, and the individual that can't really edit their work because they don't hold the visual symbol pattern. Executive functions, we've all heard of these. These are critical for thinking, problem solving, and planning. In my book, I talk about this as hitting the wall. This is the person that can't generate strategies or solutions to problems, so they constantly get stuck. The capacity for recognizing faces. Imagine not being able to recognize your neighbor in the grocery store because their face is out of context. I've worked with people that have that challenge. To the ability to learn motor plans, which are necessary for writing. We've all probably seen someone who can tell a beautiful story orally, but you put a pen in their hand and very little ends up on the page. Or auditory memory functions. These are involved in retaining information. So we've probably met the person who has to scribble notes everywhere to remember what they're supposed to do, or the person who goes to the store after you've asked them to buy 5 things and they come home with 3 and no recollection that there are 2 that are missing. The person that doesn't like audiobooks because they don't pick up content from listening. Or the student that comes home, they know they have homework, but they can't remember the instructions from the teacher. Another cognitive function is understanding number or quantity, and this is critical for time scheduling, budgeting. Think of the person who's always running late or always running out of money. It often is due to a difficulty in this cognitive function. And then the capacity for grasping relationships necessary for comprehension. This was one of my major challenges, and it led to a real lack of understanding of my world. Reasoning spatially, this is critical to be able to navigate. This is the person that can't read a map, that gets lost. and takes extra time to get anywhere, or doesn't really like to go to IKEA and have to build those bookcases where you have to go from a map, a two-dimensional representation, into three-dimensional space. So again, I encourage you, if you're interested, try the cognitive questionnaire to get a snapshot of your profile and see what insight that gives in terms of your functioning. So I've also learned that there's explanatory value in looking at behavior through what I call a cognitive lens, that understanding an individual's unique profile gives us insight into and explains behavior. So if we wanted to think about uh, the person who's socially awkward, and we might call them rude, or the person that can't see another person's point of view, we may say they lack empathy. The person that's rigid, I was that person. I was incredibly rigid because of my learning difficulty. We may say they're stubborn. The person that can't tidy the room, we may label them as messy, disorganized, or slovenly. The person that can't find a specific item in the fridge or their closet, we may say, well, they aren't really trying hard enough, they're inattentive, they lack focus. The person that can't schedule time, so they're always late, we may say that this person is inconsiderate. The person that doesn't follow instructions, we may say they're irresponsible or they don't really listen. Or the person that can tell great stories yet can't write them down, they often get labeled as lazy. And what happens, these labels end up sticking, and they start to define the individual externally by people outside of the individual, and internally. They come to internalize these labels. And these labels don't offer really an understanding of or solution to what is driving behavior. Each one of these is a different cognitive function. And as humans, we often look at behavior and we attribute it to emotional causes. I'm arguing in many cases it's cognitive, and we need to look at it from a cognitive lens. So, example, and these were two areas that I had a huge challenge. I had no insight, no idea why anything happened in my world. I thought everything was sort of random, with a puppet master pulling strings. So you might meet somebody, you think this person has no insight into anything. And again, our first impulse is to attribute this to personality or to emotional factors. It may be the symbol relations cognitive function. If somebody has a weakness in this function, they can't make connections, they can't understand relationships, they don't understand cause and effect, like why things happen. They can't understand, they can't connect their internal world to their external experiences. So they walk around in a very kind of confused, uncertain world. And they have trouble benefiting from therapy, and often are labeled as resistant by the therapist. It's because they can't connect information to actually benefit from the therapeutic process. So again, you see someone lack of insight, start to question and look at, could this be coming from a cognitive place, not emotional? Some individuals get labeled as stubborn or rigid. I can put my hand up again. That was in grade one of the big labels that I got. And again, in many cases, this could be due to this difficulty in the symbol relations cognitive function. And behavior can be multiply determined. I'm not saying everything's cognitive. However, we need to start looking at the cognitive, because that's often not in the equation. So if somebody has the difficulty that I had, the symbol relations, they can't see and consider an alternative way of viewing a situation. If I figured something out in my life, it was so hard won and so difficult that I held on for dear life. And if somebody came to me and said, well, why don't you consider looking at it this way, it actually would feel like a physical attack, because it was so hard to let go of what I'd finally figured out to try to integrate something else into that. So I was stubborn and I was rigid. An individual with this difficulty can't understand and process two or more ideas, and they can't consider another person's point of view, again, because they can't compare and contrast. So again, we see these behaviors in our work, in our practice. What I'm arguing and asking is, let's contemplate that it could be a cognitive area of difficulty that's driving this behavior. And we need to think about that, because if it is, that's critical in terms of how we're going to address it. So I want us to think about a situation that we've all been in, a social situation. This could be just a gathering of friends in the community. It could be a social gathering of people at work. And we've all experienced this, and it looks like a pretty simple situation. So what are some of the activities if we find ourselves in this situation? So the first, we might go and scan the room to look for a familiar face. Then we might have to remember that person's name, how we met them, what they do, who they are, so their biographical data. We need to interpret an opportunity. Is there an opportunity where I can interrupt or interject myself into a situation? Then someone may approach you in the situation. Do you have a plan for how you want to interact with that person? Maybe you want to have small talk, just very casual conversation. Maybe depending on the person, you want to get into more friendly debate or a discussion on a topic. And you need to focus on the conversation to avoid distractions, because obviously there's opportunity for lots of distractions in this kind of social situation. So these are some of the activities that one might engage in that situation. And if we think about it, there are multiple different cognitive functions that underlie these seemingly simple behaviors. And if somebody has a difficulty in any one of these, it's going to impact their ability to engage in a social situation, which absolutely will have an impact on their mental health. If they can't, recognize the face, they're going to walk by somebody that they know, and that person may think, well, they're snubbing me or they're rude. Or if they can't pick up the social cue that actually this is not an appropriate time to interject myself into that situation, again, they may be labeled as rude or butting in. So it's, again, thinking about all these actions. Our brain is driving how we behave in these situations. And then it's also driving the reaction that other people have to us because of how we're acting in the situation. So I want to look more closely at 4 different critical cognitive functions that underlie emotional intelligence and social emotional well-being. And these are really higher order cognitive functions, but they have significant impact on mental health if they're underfunctioning, performing, or operating at a deficit level. So I'll talk about each one. There's symbol relations, predicative speech, symbolic thinking, and nonverbal thinking. So if we look at symbol relations, this is that one that I had difficulty. I couldn't do cause and effect. I couldn't understand the why of things. I couldn't process complex relations. I couldn't comprehend. I couldn't understand things. So it's critical for logical reasoning, understanding the why, perspective taking. So if somebody has a difficulty here, what might be the mental health impact? And this is the impact on mental health specific to the nature of the cognitive function. It's not the more general that I'll get into next, just the more general stress. So if somebody has a difficulty here, and I can check every single one of these because I had this difficulty, you walk around in a constant sense of uncertainty because you can never verify meaning. And Alexander Luria, who's one of my big gurus, the neuroscientist from Russia, who I based some of my work on, talked about this in one of his books, that you're constantly walking around in a cloud of unknowing because you can never verify meaning. So it feels like the ground is shifting under your feet all the time. So there's no certainty. And that is very, very challenging to live in that experience. And that's often why somebody with this difficulty doesn't like changes in routines, because there's so much uncertainty in their world. They want something that's routine. There's difficulty grasping jokes or irony. So not being part of, the social scene where people are making jokes or, sharing fun anecdotes, you just don't grasp them. You struggle to understand and communicate your own feelings, leading to anxiety and depression. again, having difficulty understanding another point of view, which impacts empathy. You lack insight into your behavior or the behavior of others. So you can look, again, inconsiderate. And it's not that you're inconsiderate, you just don't have insight into why you're behaving or why other people are behaving that way. The world can feel confusing, it can feel random and unpredictable. So as I mentioned before, the person struggles with change. And this difficulty is very central to the development of the sense of self. I'd say more so than any of the other cognitive functions. And it can lead to a very disconnected, fragmented sense of self. So that's the mental health impact that this cognitive function can have. And with this difficulty, it's very hard to benefit from therapy, which I'll talk about a bit later, because you can't do cause and effect, you can't make connections. So you're struggling emotionally because of a cognitive difficulty, and you can't benefit from the therapeutic process. Then predicative speech. This is sort of a kind of sequential logic. If this, then that. It's really critical. Before we do something, we often run an internal dialogue in our head. We kind of run scenarios in inner speech. If somebody has a difficulty here, they can't rehearse actions in inner speech before they act them out. So their behavior can look impulsive or ill-considered. I call this the do before you ask a child, right? Because they're always doing things without checking, because they can't do that initial check or rehearsal before they actually engage in the activity. So that's the mental health impact of that difficulty. Then symbolic thinking. This is, I believe, the left prefrontal cortex, critical for executive functioning, thinking, planning, problem solving, setting goals, and staying focused until you actually come to a solution. And the mental health impact, if you have a difficulty, if there's a difficulty here, this is that hitting the wall that I mentioned. This is the person can't generate solutions to problems, so they get stuck, and they may appear passive, right? Because there's a problem in front of them and they just kind of sit there. Is because that generative part of the brain can't come up with problem solving and solutions. They have a lot of difficulty maintaining focus, so they often leave things incomplete, and that may lead to others seeing them as irresponsible or not following through. They have limited consequential thinking, so they may get themselves into trouble because, again, they haven't thought out the consequences of what they're doing. And they're often seen as scattered and disorganized, which they are, but again, it's cognitive. And then the nonverbal thinking, this is the part of the brain, I believe, the right prefrontal cortex, that's responsible for really perceiving and interpreting nonverbal information. So it can be physical, it can be auditory, like voice tone, the look of somebody's face. And it's really critical for navigating social relations and social interactions. One of the things we see is, the adolescent students are working, improving this cognitive function as they start successfully dating. So we know it's working. So if somebody has this problem, what's the mental health impact? Well, they don't perceive or interpret nonverbal cues accurately, so they're socially awkward. I call this the leap before you look. This is the individual that quickly surveys a nonverbal situation, like a social situation. They don't take in all of the relevant information that's required to act, and they act without all of that information. So their actions often are inappropriate or not really well thought out. And they also have trouble modifying their behavior because they don't pick up the nonverbal cues. Like, if somebody's rolling their eyes, someone that's good here would recognize, well, I shouldn't be continuing that behavior given that reaction. Well, they don't read those cues, so they continue the behavior. So it kind of summarizes where I want to go with this part of the presentation. It's really, when we're thinking about mental health and learning difficulties, we have to consider the cognitive profile. And we have to consider that a deficit in certain specific cognitive functions will have a very specific impact on mental health. Not all of them will, but these four that I talked about will absolutely have a significant impact on shaping the individual's experience in the world and shaping how people are responding and reacting to that person in the world. And so I think it's really important that we get curious and we ask questions and observe the individual's behavior through a cognitive lens rather than just attributing it to personality or emotions. And one of the tools that people could use is the cognitive questionnaire. As I said, it's on the website, it's confidential, it's free. And if you do it and you have questions, you can contact one of the sites around the world that's offering the Aerosmith program. And usually there'll be somebody that can have a conversation with you about your cognitive questionnaire if that's something you'd be interested in. So to me, this is one of the missing pieces I see in the conversation around mental health and learning disabilities. There's lots of research and lots of information on the next piece that I'll talk about, the general, the impact of general stress of living on a day-to-day basis with a learning difficulty. There's very little information. In fact, I have not been able to find much or any information on looking at behavior through this cognitive perspective. Certainly there is if there's been traumatic brain injury, but I'm talking about learning difficulties. So I would really encourage everybody to start getting curious and start thinking about behavior and mental health in this way. So what's the next area? This is just the general impact of living with a learning difficulty on mental health. And it is also very, very significant. And this is irrespective of what cognitive functions are underlying the learning difficulty. These factors run across all different kinds of learning difficulties. This is a quote from Norman Doidge, who wrote The Brain's Way of Healing, The Brain That Changes Itself, and he wrote the foreword to my book. So he says, learning difficulties, detected or not, can have developmentally devastating effects, such as broken dreams, self-hate, depression, substance abuse. Statistically, learning difficulties can lead to mental health problems, job problems, substance abuse, and marital failure, all of which the research shows. So I interviewed, when I was writing my book, hundreds and hundreds of individuals with learning difficulties to hear from them what their experience was like. So as I did some of this research, I found quotes of these individuals that absolutely illustrated what the research is talking about. So this is Dr. Jacob Lieberman talks about, I found that under stress, people have a tendency to constrict physiologically, emotionally, perceptually, and functionally. And this was an individual at 55 years old. And he said one of the side effects of learning disabilities is contraction. Rather than expand into the universe with all the other accelerating particles, I hid in my room and rusticated into a deep depression. And then school is a stressor. Like, I mean, we all think school can be stressful, but if you have a learning difficulty, school is a major life stressor. You've got test anxiety, social anxiety, general anxiety, and then the accumulated failure that you experience in school leads to low self-esteem, which leads to a lowered ability to cope. And the academic environment is experienced actually as threatening. The school that I went to, the elementary school, was right across the street from my house. I could look out my living room window and see the school. And every day when I left my home to go to school, I dragged my feet because I hated school because of my experience. So I definitely experienced school as threatening. And this is another quote from another individual. He says, well, most kids were out having fun. I was slaving away nights and weekends. I liken high school to a boxing match. Sure, you make it to the 15th round, but your ego is black and blue. And then another impact of learning difficulties is that students with learning difficulties are less likely to mobilize peers for emotional support when dealing with an academic or interpersonal stressor. They experience less peer acceptance. They're cut off from the typical peer supports that enable most students to cope with stress. They have greater feelings of loneliness, social isolation. So having the learning difficulty exposes the individual to more risk factors for stress, and they have fewer supports to cope with those stressors. It's really a catch-22. And then we know from the research that if you have a learning difficulty, it increases your likelihood of being bullied. And this was a 13-year-old girl that talked about when she was in second grade, she moved to a new school. It was hard for her being the new kid, especially when you have problems with your brain. There was a person in an older grade than me. Every day he would come up to me and bully me because I couldn't learn like the other kids could. Every day I was terrified that he would hurt me by calling me names and telling me I wouldn't get through life. All those words he said to me got stuck in my brain, and I never forgot those words. So again, this affects mental health because having the learning difficulty, you're different, and often a target for bullying. And then to me, because I'm always thinking about the brain, what does this stress do to the brain? Like separate from whether you have a learning disability or not, but the stress of the learning disability is stress. So we know that stress chemicals impact cognitive functioning both in the short term and the long term. The short term, we know if we're anxious or stressed, we don't remember information as well, we don't comprehend as well, we can't concentrate as well. But to me, what's really concerning is the long-term chronic stress, prolonged anxiety and depression actually lead to negative brain changes, which impact cognitive functioning. So here you have an individual with a learning difficulty already struggling with areas of weakness in cognition. And the fact of this unremitting stress actually has a negative neuroplastic effect on the brain. Neuroplasticity is just a neutral concept. You can drive positive neuroplastic change or negative neuroplastic change. And this research study that was done in 2012 looked at various factors that contribute to negative neuroplasticity, and chronic stress was one of them. And it actually can lead to loss of synapses, shrinkage, retraction of dendrites, which are really critical for neurotransmission, and pruning of axons, thereby reducing communication in the brain and in brain areas. So stress is really important for us to work at reducing. Then there's research looking at having a learning difficulty, anxiety, and sleep. And there's research is showing a significant relationship. If one has a learning difficulty, they tend to have problems with anxiety, and they have sleep problems. This was a study of adolescents 14 to 20. And they were related to worry about, all their negative self-talk, negative feelings would disturb their sleep. And again, this is a student that illustrated that point. She said, though I'm exhausted, I find it difficult to fall asleep at night with negative self-talk I give myself and the stress of the whole situation. And why is sleep important to learning? In another sort of catch-22, this is a study, an image at the top with the brain awake, and this is the individual learning something during the day while awake, and then the same brain at night during REM sleep. And you can see similar areas there's similar neural activity, because what's happening is the brain is replaying that learning over and sort of consolidating and recoding the brain. So sleep is really important for consolidating our learning. And people with learning difficulties experience sleep problems. So the stress of a learning difficulty can have negative impact on the brain. The stress and anxiety can have a negative impact on sleep, which then can have a compounding negative impact on learning. And then depression and learning difficulties. So the research tells us that individuals with learning difficulties have increased levels of depression. Certainly I struggled with depression, and it was many, many years after I addressed my learning difficulty, many years of therapy, which now I could benefit from, to support me of overcoming being quite significantly depressed. So individuals with learning difficulties experience negative patterns of thinking regarding their self, regarding their future. And what's really critical is they view the negative experiences of their life as personal, permanent, and pervasive. So they feel they don't have locus of control. They feel there's really nothing they can do to change the circumstances, which leads to them feeling helpless. And what I found really fascinating in this study was they also had parents rate what they saw in their children in terms of depression, and there was no correlation between what the students were reporting and what the parents reported. So it suggests that the parents aren't as aware of the mental health or emotional challenges their children are experiencing as a result of the learning difficulties. And with adolescents with learning difficulties, there's a higher risk of suicide. And I attempted suicide at age 13. So like I think I'm the poster child for mental health issues and learning difficulties. And then there's the imposter phenomena that we hear about, and this is very common in individuals with learning difficulties. They see themselves as frauds. They believe that if they have a success, it isn't really due to any inherent capacity that they have. It's just luck, right? It's just a fluke. And they live in fear of being exposed as a fraud, and they work hard at times to present a false impression, which this individual talked about. He said, to everyone I meet, I have to appear supremely confident, competent, and strong, but I'm a fraud inside. I'm screaming in frustration, pain, insecurity, and shame. And then this is my quote. I definitely had imposter phenomena. I wrote, I felt like I was an imposter. If I did well, it was a fluke. I spent so much energy trying to stay invisible so no one would see that I was a fraud. I lived in a constant state of anxiety that I would be asked to do something I wouldn't understand, and the house of cards would come tumbling down, and my incompetence would be exposed for the world to see. I was convinced when I was hired by the university after completing my bachelor's degree that the university needed to keep me around because I would be an embarrassment to them. Most people would think it was like an honor to be hired by the university. I felt like they couldn't let me out in the world because I would tarnish the reputation of the university. And interesting, I talk in my book about my experience of the learning difficulty. But as I mentioned, in the process of writing the book, I interviewed several hundred individuals, asking them to describe their experiences related to learning difficulties. And it was fascinating. They all talked about making a pact of silence. That's what they called it, where out of shame, they did not share their struggles with their families. And I was a member of this pact because there was stigma, there was shame. I didn't want to burden others with my struggles. So the end result is that we isolate ourselves and we don't access what support might be available due to our shame and our desire to appear competent and like everyone else. And that's what that research study on depression showed, that the parents weren't as fully aware of the actual experience that their children were having. And part of it is that we're not wanting to share with them the challenges and difficulties of our experience. And I think it's so important that we really need to create an environment in which we normalize having a learning difficulty. But it's no different than, say, having diabetes. There should not be tremendous stigma, and there still is today. When I go around the world and talk to students, I still hear this pact of silence and this stigma. And I think one of the things that we can all do is create an open environment where children, adults that are struggling with this have an opportunity to talk very openly about it, because things fester in silence. And then school is a metaphor of life for life. This was a parent once said this to me, and I liked the phrase. But a lot of people see a learning difficulty as an educational problem and think, okay, once the child is out of school, they'll be okay. That really they just have to finish schooling and get on with their life. they don't really see the significant impact on the individual's mental health, and that this continues into adulthood. And as all of the research shows, these problems follow the individual into their adult relationships and into their workplace. And I've worked with a lot of adults over the past, 47 years now, I think it is. And I labeled this, what I was seeing, called a cognitive mismatch. This is where an adult is in a job that the demands of the job aren't really commensurate with their cognitive profile. So, kind of a similar experience that they had at school, that they're being asked to do things that are really challenging and difficult because they don't have a strength in that area. And some of what, we talk about human error, like where, that's human error. Sometimes I think it could have been a cognitive mismatch. Just really briefly, I worked with a pilot who had the memory problem, and he couldn't remember the instructions from the air traffic controller, which is a little bit of a worry. And I used to ask him, where are you flying, and make sure I wasn't in the same airspace. But the better thing is we addressed the problem. He can now remember the information. He had strategies, but strategies don't always work. And I worked with a butcher who had the kinesthetic problem. So he didn't know where his left hand was in space. And the first day I met him, his left hand was all wrapped up in bandages because he was accidentally cutting himself a significant amount of time. So if one has a learning difficulty and it hasn't been addressed, it will follow the individual into life. I've got lots and lots of examples if people are curious. There are probably some on the website, and there are lots in my book. So what are some of the statistics in terms of mental health and learning difficulties? If people are interested, there's probably one of the most brilliant studies I have ever read. It was done here in Canada. It's called PACFold. It's Putting a Canadian Face on Learning Disabilities. And the website, there's pacfold.ca. They looked at all sorts of data, I think something like 15,000 individuals. And they looked at mental health, physical health, employment, relationships, the cost, the actual monetary cost of having a learning disability over one's lifetime. It's probably one of the best studies I've ever read. So these statistics come out of that. And these were adults 30 to 44 years old. And they looked at, there's 3 times the rate of diagnosed anxiety disorder in individuals with learning difficulties compared to individuals without. 89% of the individuals without learning disabilities were employed, 51% of learning difficulties, long-term relationships. The people without learning difficulties, 54% were in long-term relationship, but only 28% of those with LD. And 28% of those with an LD reported poor mental and physical health versus 8% of people without learning disability. And I just want to mention very tangentially, when I was talking about stress, and you think about cortisol, and you think about, like somebody said, cortisol is an acid bath to the brain, but it's also an acid bath to your immune system. I mean, it's a little dramatic, but it is. And for years, like I developed an autoimmune disorder, and I was convinced it was related to the stress of my learning difficulties, and everybody said absolutely not. Well, now the research says absolutely yes. If you're in an unremitting stressful situation, all of that cortisol that washes through your system has a very deleterious effect on your physical health. So that was really interesting that this study showed that individuals with learning difficulties were more likely to have poor physical health. And again, there can be multiple reasons, but one I believe strongly is the stressor. So I'm going to go really quickly because I want time for a question. So this is just a summary of all of the research that, compared to people without a learning difficulty, individuals with learning difficulties do more poorly in school, lower literacy tests, lower levels of social acceptance, less likely to complete secondary school, more likely to be unemployed or not seeking employment. If they are employed, they tend to earn less. As an adult, maybe still living with a parent, less likely to be married or in a long-term relationship, more likely to report mental health status as fair or poor, physical health as fair or poor, more likely to report suicidal thoughts, anxiety, depression, distress, and effects of chronic stress. for anybody, and specifically because having a learning difficulty can lead to chronic stress. You get poor mental, physical, and cognitive health. So really significant. So again, if we revisit that World Health Organization definition of mental health, I would argue that having a learning difficulty and all of what goes along with it makes it very hard to meet all of the criteria of this definition of mental health. And so, what can we do about it? I think the challenge starts with the brain. So, what are some of the options? I mean, this concept of neuroplasticity, we know our brain is capable of change. I believe we have the knowledge now to leverage neuroplasticity to strengthen cognitive functions, and that as critical neural networks strengthen, the result is improved social, emotional well-being and mental health. So I'm going to stop probably after one more slide. So if we think about this, I said neuroplasticity, there can be negative factors driving negative neuroplasticity and positive factors. So what can we do right now in our life or in the life of someone that we care about that's struggling with a learning difficulty? We can work to reduce these negative factors. We can to reduce chronic stress, prolonged anxiety, get the person the support they need. Pain is unrelated to having a learning difficulty, but there's lots of research that shows that pain actually has a very significant negative neuroplastic effect on the brain, chronic long-term pain, sleep deprivation, depression. So we can do things to reduce these negative factors, things like exercise. We know that exercise is neuroprotective to the brain, that it stimulates brain-derived neurotrophic factor in the brain, which is neuroprotective, that it can create neurogenesis, grow new neurons. So exercise, we can all exercise. Meditation, there's lots of good research on that. The other areas, the active sustained engagement, effort for processing, novelty, complexity, reward, that those are all things to go into creating a neuroplastic program, which I don't have time to go into right now. But at a minimum, and it's very significant, we can take those things in the negative factors and we can address them. I'm just going to jump. So just in our work really quickly, we're seeing changes with the cognitive program in really critical neural networks. We're doing imaging research, and these are networks that are really important in mental health. So there's a series of webinars that are on our website that I'll point you to at the end that will give you all this information. I apologize because I want time for questions. Again, all the research is on our website. I apologize for going really quickly. I'm going to jump to the summary of our social emotional well-being, because what I argue is you change the brain, it changes cognition, it changes your ability to learn, and it changes your social emotional well-being, your mental health. And we're seeing this. We're doing research in Toowoomba in Australia, in Teen Challenge, with individuals in the treatment program for drug and alcohol addiction. We're doing a research study right now at Brigham Women's in Boston and Harvard. Like our brain is central to how we see the world, relate to the world, understand the world. So as we change that, all of these things change, increase the locus of control, growth mindset, self-awareness, self-reflection, perspective taking, empathy, and reduction in cortisol. This was one study that the kids loved because they got to spit at the beginning of the study and they got to spit at the end of the study because we measured cortisol in saliva. So this is all on our website. And neuroplastic approach, cognitive change benefits therapy. We're seeing this. There's a psychiatrist in Virginia that does our program, and she said the most wonderful things about Aerosmith is that it creates the capacity to talk about events, not simply react to flashbacks. Patients can recognize that they're not in the past and they can build links to the future. Very similar things that we're seeing in the research in Australia and in other places, and that they can benefit from therapy. Norman Deutsch here in Toronto got interested in my work because he had clients that could not benefit from insight therapy, just like I couldn't. And he, rather than blaming the client and saying you're being resistant, he thought there's something cognitive going on here. we started to collaborate. They worked through the Symbol Relations program. They can now benefit from insight therapy. The head of chief psychiatrist at St. Joseph's Health Center here had the same experience. There are different types of neuroplastic therapy programs that are coming out. I think we're going to see more and more. Aerosmith would probably go under the cognitive enrichment program version, but all of these have positive neuroplastic benefits. So I would say if the source of the difficulty in many cases is the brain, we need a neuroplastic therapeutic approach to really significantly address the problem. And I dream of the day when cognitive transformation is just a normal journey of education, that through this cognitive transformation, we unlock each individual's gifts, we allow them to dare to dream, and there are just a few resources. The Brain Pioneer and Brain School are free downloads books made available by the author on our website. My book has each chapter is a different part of the brain and how it impacts us. Chapter 2 in Norman, The Brain That Changes Itself, is on our work. And if people are interested in that webinar, go onto our website under events, and it's called Shaping Our Brains, how neuroplasticity can enrich our lives. And I think there are 4 or 5 webinars in the series, really excellent, and will cover a lot more than what I covered.
Such a great presentation, and I think a lot of people are going to really appreciate the link between cognitive processes and mental health, and just thinking about it in a different way, not just a reaction to having learning struggles, but deeply connected to the way individuals process information. Yeah. So we appreciate that you spearheading this conversation. So I wanted to get to one of the questions. Some of them you've actually already answered, and so they were answered while you were speaking. One person said, curious how much of these categories of cognitive functions are development for many kids? In other words, can kids grow out of these conditions through real life experiences? And if so, is technology leading to the failure to launch syndrome, since kids don't get these real world issues to adjust their deficits?
That's a really good complex question.
It is.
I'll answer a little bit of the last one. When I started this work way back when, and was reading Luria's one of his books, Higher Cortical Functions in Man, and there was a chapter on the prefrontal cortex and that executive functioning. And I thought, oh my, it was just so fascinating to me. And I wanted to see people with that difficulty. And probably over the first 10 years of my practice, maybe I saw 10 people. Now, probably 70% of the individuals we work with have executive functioning. And I think what happened over that period of time, and I think what drives the prefrontal cortex is that active, sustained engagement, having to dig into something, having to be a little frustrated and figure out ways to, solve problems. And we've evolved into a world where things are pre-digested. We have things in sound bites. Everything is 30 seconds or less. So it's not stimulating the prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of the brain that keeps developing as long as we're alive, right? So can I say for certain that's why I'm seeing so many more individuals with that difficulty, but it makes sense as a hypothesis. So it is a concern. We need kids that can actively think and problem solve. I mean, the good news is we can address it through the work and we can stimulate that part of the brain, but I think we're doing a disservice, and who knows what AI is going to do now. And AI is just a tool. We can use it in positive ways, but a lot of ways it's being used right now are not positive. So that's sort of the end. But if there's a real cognitive deficit, like there can be a difference that something isn't getting stimulated over one's experience, so it kind of goes dormant in a sense because of that lack of stimulation. But the majority of individuals that come into my work around the world have learning difficulties that are definite cognitive functions that are underperforming, and they don't grow out of them, right? I mean, it's like you can see the trajectory, you can see the history, and maybe there's some that do that I don't see them, right? So I wouldn't know, but certainly, the individuals we work with have profiles of strengths and weaknesses, and those weaknesses you can trace back, for many, many years. And though, to me, what is so promising is the brain's neuroplastic capacity for change, that we don't have to be limited by our current cognitive functioning. We can actually stimulate and enhance the functioning, which to me is so, so promising.
Yes. And I think it's so interesting, the failure to launch question, because I think we're living in an increasingly complex world,
Mhm.
when that, which also means there's an increased demand for executive functions.
Yes.
And at the same time, a lot of individuals, like you're saying, are given the tool. So kids don't have to look at an analog clock and figure out what time it is. They can say, Alexa, what time is it? And they
Mhm.
will get the answer, right?
Yes.
They don't
Yeah.
have to determine what is credible research and what is non-credible.
Mhm.
They just have to tell AI what they're researching, and then all of these studies will
Yeah.
populate. And
Yeah.
so I think that there are, that's contributing to some
Yeah.
of the failure to launch issues, particularly if you already have struggles in executive functioning and problem solving and
Mhm.
those other, aligned cognitive domains.
Exactly. And that's why, huge part of my vision, like talked about putting the brain in the education equation, is starting in grade one, 30 minutes a day. Students do a cognitive exercise 5 days a week. It's an infinitesimal amount of time that we're asking for. And I have a whole plan. Like I know what we do in grade one, what the cognitive function is developmentally appropriate, and then grade two and grade three. And there are some schools around the world, there in Spain, Australia, I think New Zealand, that are doing that, right? And that then there is no stigma, because every child in that grade is doing 30 minutes a day of a cognitive exercise. And I think, what is that going to look like 10 years from now? Like, hopefully we'll have individuals that can think, problem solve, strategize, be flexible, have empathy, to help solve the really complicated problems that we have in the world.
Right. I think we have time for one more question. And then, of course, we're going to give everyone a copy of the recording. And so if you've been on the call, you'll get an email from me in the next day or two with a copy of the recording, and also Barbara's contact information, so you can get in touch with her. Um, Bonita wrote that her child is on the Aerosmith program, but she's struggling with friendships and long-term bullying, and both the school and themselves feel stuck, can't decide what to do. Her child wants to switch schools, but she's concerned about the problems following her child to another school and wonders what can they do. I think a lot of parents worry about that when their kids struggle and there's been an intervention put in place, but some of the struggles persist. Like, what
Mhm.
are their options?
Yeah. Well, what I would suggest, because if she's in the program somewhere, we probably have some data. If she wants to email that questions at aerosmith.ca,
Mhm.
and I can see that somebody addresses specifically what her question is. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Barbara, this has been such a great conversation. I put links to the interview that we did on the podcast, where you dig deep into your early history. And I think that really has shaped the work that you're doing. And it's really transformed the lives of so many kids once we better understand. I always say, when you better understand why a child is struggling, you're in a better position to support them both academically and emotionally, and help them to really succeed in the world and reach their full potential. So again, I want to thank you for being here. And I look forward to our next conversation that we're going to have. For those of you who want to keep in touch with us, again, you're going to get an email with all of our contact information, and the next webinar, which is going to be next month: High Expectations, Hidden Struggles When Neurodivergence Meets Pressure to Achieve.
Mhm.
So we will be talking about that next month. So thank you all for being here, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much, Barbara.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.